My guest today is Spencer Greenberg. He is the founder of clearthinking.org and the Clear Thinking podcast. And today we go into the whole world of mental models and perspectives on thinking clear. One of the things that we discuss is his theory of the worldviews as self-contained snow globes with their own cardinal values and virtues. Then we discussed the interactions between these worldviews, the importance of in-group and out-group signaling to how we build these perspectives on the world. Then we also discussed his idea of valueism and how to more effectively live according to your own values. Then we also discussed how we should relate to the unfortunate, just existing fact of average group differences all over the place. And then we also discuss the problem of imprecise speech and how people hide behind it, and how much of a problem this ambiguity is when forming a perspective on the truth. So I think you'll really enjoy this episode. I really do recommend that you guys check out Spencer's podcast. It's really, really good. At the same time, I also want to recommend that you please do sign up on Substack or Patreon, wherever you can, and support the show. This is how we keep the lights on. It's my passion project, and this is what makes it all work. So thank you so much if you can support it. If not, the free version covers most of the conversation, but not all of it. So if you want to access the whole conversation and all sorts of little tidbits, the community, everything that's tied to the world of Subversive, please do go at Substack and Patreon. The links are in the show notes. Thank you so much and enjoy. I think a very interesting and valuable piece of writing that I read on your blog recently is your kind of theory of worldviews as these kind of self-contained snow globes. I really like that metaphor, kind of aligned with specific cardinal virtues. They have a structure, they're kind of internally coherent. And I think like I mentioned in our chat before we started recording, I have been in many a snow globe, and I have been a true believer in many a snow globe. But now, having gone through successive snow globes, I am now trying to study the structure from the outside of what exactly it is that one of these snow globes encompasses. So maybe you could kind of give us an intro on, okay, what is your theory of worldviews? What is a worldview? What are the parameters here?
Yeah, great question. So if you forget for a moment that you're a person with a particular perspective and you just imagine you're an alien, you're looking at human society, what you'll notice is that there are different worldviews and people are incredibly confident in their own worldview and think the other worldviews are dumb. But if you take that outside perspective and just kind of look at them as a group, you could ask the question, well, what are these things? What are these belief systems? And so we analyzed a bunch of different worldviews. And what that led us to conclude is there's actually 4 things that every worldview has in common. And those are: 1, they have a notion of what is good. Second, they have a notion of where good and bad come from. Third, they have a notion of who deserves the good. And fourth, they have a notion of how you can do good or be good. And so just to give an example to make it concrete, let's think about the worldview of American Christian conservatives. And just to say, there are lots of different minor variations of worldviews. So I'm not going to say like every American Christian conservative believes the same thing. But if we just kind of broad strokes say, what do American Christian conservatives believe? Well, we can ask the first question, what is good? Well, they think faith is good, piety, humility, self-sacrifice, right? Well, where does good come from? God, obviously, is the answer. Where does bad come from? Well, some will say the devil, some will say humanity's sinful nature. Okay, who deserves good? They'll either say the faithful, or maybe they'll say, well, nobody really deserves it, but through God's grace, we can get what's good, right? So that kind of encapsulates the American Christian conservative worldview, the answer to those 4 questions. We could do it for other worldviews as well. We could look at, for example, libertarians and say, well, what is good? Well, freedom, personal choice, individualism. Where does good come from? Well, pursuing your own goals and exercising your talents. And maybe if they're more, Randian, they, pursuing self-interest. Where does bad come from? Well, it comes from people trying to control others or top-down control, regulation, and bureaucracy. And who deserves good things? Well, it's people who work to produce value in the world, right? So from an outside perspective, we look at these worldviews and say, okay, we can kind of encapsulate what these worldviews are saying. And then once we do that, we can start to discuss what is right about these worldviews? What are they pointing out that's useful? And what are they getting wrong? Or where are they making unhelpful suggestions? And so that's what I'm trying to do, is be able to take a bird's eye view and see the good and the bad in each worldview, be able to put them on like a pair of lenses, or see the world from their perspective like I'm inside a snow globe, but then be able to step outside and see the world from other perspectives as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful way of encapsulating it. Obviously, as a participant in many a snow globe, I can see the kind of the resistance of doing this exercise as someone who obviously, I mean, you yourself probably have, a belief system that aligns more or less with one of these systems that you've come to probably either, you've deduced that this is a rational way of thinking, but there's probably some component of it just being either how you grew up, innate, the values of people around you, also factors flowing into it. And I can, there's probably a lot of psychological resistance to. Have you found this exercise to be super easy? Are you special in this regard? How has that been for you?
Yeah, what I would say is that I think every single snow globe is wrong if we really think about from an objective point of view. But almost every snow globe has something right about it, or is on to something that's worth understanding. So I don't think there's a right snow globe. And the reason is fundamentally, you can see that there's no right one because every single one of them is way oversimplified. Right? Every single one of them is saying this is all that matters, or this is most of what matters, and this is where good comes from, and this is who deserves good things. When in reality, it's more complicated than that, right? So every one is wrong. Many of them are useful, at least in certain ways or certain times, or for seeing something of value. So that's the attitude I try to adopt. Not to say that I don't have a belief system. I do have a belief system. I have opinions about things, but I do try my best to be able to leverage what's good from a bunch of these different perspectives.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has helped me loosen my perspective a little bit on the particular snow globes that I was involved in has been the strange bundling of issues that are reflected in different worldviews, and people are really like issues like, I mean, what you described here are like the very high level things like what is good, what isn't good, but a lot of things kind of are drawn into things like, for example, the issue of lab grown meat has become very kind of contentious, and it's kind of tied to a very particular snow globe. And it's not necessarily something that ties into these virtues, but it's kind of been hoovered up into a worldview. And there's like a very much a pro version, very much a con version. I mean, is this just kind of positioning against the outgroup? I mean, how important is the outgroup to the coherence of the snow globe?
A good question. So, in addition to these four elements that all worldviews have, there are also many optional elements that many worldviews have, but not all. For example, many worldviews, but not all, have an outgroup that basically so that they view themselves as being opposed to. Right. And so if you're in one of those snow globes, you're going to view this other group as being evil, the source of bad things, the group you have to oppose. In addition, many worldviews also come with sets of kind of randomish beliefs that are just kind of, oh, the people in my group believe this random thing, and therefore I probably believe this thing too, or at least I'm sympathetic to it. But they're not really core to the belief system inherently. They're just what that belief, what that group happens to believe right now. So, for example, being for lab-grown meat or against lab-grown meat, that's not fundamental to any worldview. But there might be worldviews at any given point in time are for or against it because maybe it supports their political agenda, or they think it's going to be promoted by people that they think are in the outgroup or what have you.
Yeah, I think in the article you give an example of someone, creating a tweet that was very popular about abortion, and if Republicans really cared about the children that were, born, if they're actually pro-life, they would be for supporting babies through social programs, through expanded maternity care, through all sorts of subsidies and things like that. And you were saying that, okay, this is not the perspective of the Republicans, but I think in a way that the tweet achieved its objective because it wasn't really for the Republicans. It was kind of a in-group signaling tweet to say, okay, it was playing in a field that was ostensibly creating an argument that was for the Republicans, but it was actually for the eyes of the in-group rather. And I think the person writing it up didn't imagine a Republican, having an aha moment while reading the tweet. They were essentially illustrating, you know, forcefully creating this narrative for their own side.
Yeah, so I sort of agree with you and I sort of disagree. I agree in the sense that, yes, the intended audience of that tweet is clearly people who are more on the progressive side. And so I'll just read a part of that tweet just so people know exactly what was said. If it was about babies, we'd have excellent and free universal maternal care. We wouldn't be charged a cent to give birth, no matter how complicated your delivery was. If it was about babies, we'd have months and months of parental leave for everyone, and so on. It goes on. And so basically the point of the tweet is that when you're talking about abortion rights, that conservatives who oppose abortion, well, they don't really care about babies. That's kind of the point of the tweet. And you're right, the intended audience is progressives. However, where I disagree with you, I think that the person who wrote this, being very rooted within one snow globe, is actually genuinely unable or unwilling to see the world from another snow globe that feels in opposition to hers. So I think she genuinely believes that conservatives are full of shit about this topic, as opposed to knowing that actually many of them think that abortion is really murder and that's why they oppose it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also how this ties into kind of accusations of hypocrisy across the aisle, and it doesn't feel like it works. Like from inside the group, if someone accuses you of being a hypocrite, that's credible. But if this type of accusation of hypocrisy, it always lands flat. And I think, do you think that that's kind of part of this, like the rhetorical guns that people have from the outgroup are always kind of, they always seem blunt. Or maybe this is also kind of an artifact of the internet and how things kind of accelerate and become much more internally coherent, and always kind of sharpen against the outgroups. I wonder if this was not the case maybe 50, 60 years ago when we didn't have this information infrastructure, but now it's much more the case that people are just kind of they just dismiss that type of argument out of hand.
Well, to effectively accuse someone of hypocrisy, you have to understand their values, because how do you know they're being a hypocrite otherwise? And I think this tweet kind of illustrates that point. If you were a progressive who opposed abortion and you said you did it because you cared about babies, then it would be inconsistent to also be against universal maternal care potentially, or against helping with parental leave, etc. But it's not inconsistent from a conservative worldview, because the reason that I'm not going to say all, but the reason most conservatives who are really, really against abortion are against it is because they're concerned that it's a form of murder. And so it's not at all inconsistent to not want free universal maternal care and also be opposed to abortion, right? So it only seems hypocritical from within that one worldview. And I think you're right that these charges of hypocrisy often don't ring true, but that's often because they're leveled by someone who's in a different worldview and doesn't understand the opposing worldview. And I think this also raises an interesting point, which is that even if you don't give a shit about seeing the world accurately, even if you are 100% convinced your worldview is the correct one, it's still useful to understand other people's worldviews, even if it's just to oppose them more effectively, right? Who do you think if you want to persuade people over to your side, you have to understand what other people think.
Yeah, I think I guess, you were saying, okay, if your goal isn't to have a truthful perspective on the world, I think for a lot of people, probably most people, not, this is not obvious to them, but I think deep down inside, their goals are more aligned with, um, you know, keeping links to their in-group rather than actually having, a clear view, clear perspective of and I think that's probably one of the bigger obstacles in seeing, the limitation of your particular snow globe. Yeah, it's very convenient and very important in a way for your social life, your status, your standing within your group to toe the line on lab-grown meat or whatever it is.
Absolutely. I mean, social forces are really powerful. Nobody wants to be ostracized by their group. Pretty much everyone wants to be liked, at least by some people. Some people want to be liked by everyone, but most people want to be liked by at least some people, the people that, they care about. And they can feel these intense pressures. That being said, I think many people genuinely care about the truth. They have a value of knowing what's true, believing what's true. And many people really care about policies working. These policies in society actually achieve their stated ends. When people are doing things to try to help children, for example, they don't primarily want to socially signal that they want to help children. They want to actually help children. Now, there are some that are more about signaling, than actually helping. But no, most people actually want the world to get better. And so one of the challenges of being stuck inside a single worldview too deeply is that it can lead you to have false beliefs about policies. And so you don't actually achieve the outcomes that you think you're achieving because you're not actually able to see the full picture, you're only seeing kind of one sliver of what's going on.
Yeah, I think the challenge in a lot of this is that because of this bundling and because a lot of people orient along the lines of in-group signaling, you kind of have to wear the hat of in-group signaling to actually get policies done, even if you're kind of this pursuer of truth and you're trying to be neutral, because you at this moment, pretty much anywhere in the world, you have to buy into X coalition with, whatever stance on, strange bundled issues that they have to have. And if you're this kind of wild card that has, exotic opinions on you're not going to be a very good political operator who's actually going to get stuff done. So you kind of have to go with the bundle that appeals more to your worldview. And even though a lot of them, like I said, are very incoherent.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're a politician, ultimately you end up having to make decisions saying, "Hi, okay, I'm going to support this bill. I don't like everything in this bill, but hey, it is what it is. I think the world is better off with this bill than without it, so I've got to support it." And those are a lot of tough choices I think politicians have to make because of the way things get bundled together, and they just don't have control over pulling out that one thing they like. They can't necessarily put that forward without the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, even as a general voter, now just knowing kind of who to show your allegiance to. There are all sorts of things that, maybe 50, 60 years ago, it was a bit more, I feel, clear. At least maybe there was just not as much information and granularity in the different positions. There's also not so much complexity in society that needed everyone's inputs. There also wasn't this whole politics as entertainment sphere that now kind of everyone's almost obligated to participate in, even though we can make an argument that's not necessarily very relevant to the results of democracy at large. But yeah, it feels like people are drawn into having to have an opinion, having to show their allegiance in more ways, and it's become more obligatory.
Well, I do think that in some ways things have gotten worse in politics, but I also think that what we see online is not necessarily representative of what's happening in people's ordinary lives. Like, yes, on Twitter, people are acting really bizarre politically and trying to status signal about things. But I think most people actually they're much more reasonable and they hang out with their friends and it's not a big deal. And these things are just not so at the forefront all the time. So, while I do think that there are these problems and some of them have gotten worse, I think we should also keep in mind that the performative stuff we see is not necessarily reflective of ordinary life.
Yeah, I think, what I'm kind of sensing maybe is just a bit of a trend that's not, I don't necessarily think it's like very much based on actual tangible data, just seeing how many of the people in my real life seem to be drawn more and more into maybe not necessarily Twitter politics, but definitely Facebook politics when it comes to like older generations, TikTok politics when it comes to younger generations. I mean, there's obviously all sorts of things to consume online, but it seems like this is one of the important cores. And it also overlaps a lot with another one of the really big things that seems to be, one of the big vibes of the internet that people talk, like this dating and gender discourse, the fractioning of kind of the fracture politically between the genders is very acute, and especially the younger generations. Like you have younger men being much more conservative Republican than their older counterparts, and then younger women being much more liberal. And it must have something to do with the internet. I mean, I'm now putting out my completely non-empirical opinion on this, but I could have a feeling that there's some sort of polarization going on that's tied to content they're consuming. And I can imagine also, because dating is hard. This whole domain is fraught with all sorts of issues. It's probably something that's tied into it. But yes, again, this is not completely based on information, though there are a few data points that kind of point in that direction.
Yeah, I think there is some evidence that women have grown a little bit more progressive. Like there's a Gallup poll that found from 1999 to 2023 that about 30% of 18 to 29-year-old women would say that they were very liberal, and that went up to 40%. So yeah, there does seem to be some increase there. With these trends, it can be really, really hard to say what causes them. And so, I'm reluctant to jump to a cause. The internet is certainly a plausible explanation, right? That's where a lot of people get their information these days. And for men, as I understand it, I think it's been pretty flat. I don't know that men have actually gotten more conservative, but I think that they have not gotten more progressive as far as the data I've seen.
Yeah, I think I'll have to look this up and maybe I can put it in the show notes. There was a recent kind of study out of Europe. Don't exactly know which countries it covers, Western Europe, and it was showing that like even though the proportion of men or younger men who were conservative stayed grew just a little bit, I think their allegiance between kind of classical conservatism as we'd imagine it, like fusionist Reaganist type, libertarian and socially liberal, fiscally conservative types, that's not very popular anymore. And what is popular now is kind of more of a classical form of nationalism. Like, people are much more interested in, I guess, probably immigration pressures and all of that stuff, and how that trickles into kind of perceived effects in the economy is driving this as well. But yeah, it's changed the flavor of conservatism. Like, that's really changed. Like, the contents of the box conservatism has changed quite a lot. And I probably feel about online politics. I can imagine. Yeah, it's also by the facts on the ground. Like, immigration is important to a lot of people, especially in Europe.
I'm certainly not a historian, but I think it is really interesting to just look at the history of political parties and to realize that groups that have the same name don't necessarily believe the same thing over time. And you can look back at Republicans and Democrats at different times, and you can actually see pretty big shifts in what the belief systems were. And I think we tend to think they were more similar than they were because we might call them by the same thing. But yeah, there's constant shift in belief systems, and these ideas spread as memes, not in the sense of cute images with taglines, but as in terms of pieces of information that spread culturally, and they move pretty quickly. And I suspect they move much faster now with the internet. And so I think we should expect that we'll see constantly shifting viewpoints regularly. Every few years we're going to get shifts in people's political views.
Yeah, that seems to be very yeah. That's pretty much what's going on. Just from my perspective as an outside observer, not really being so connected to the data as you are, but yeah, maybe we can move on to valueism. I think this is really interesting as well. I mean, what is value?
So when I was younger, I used to think that there might be an objective answer to what's good or what's the right thing to do or what's moral or what you should devote your life to. But I eventually came to the conclusion that not only is there not an objective answer, but that it probably doesn't even make sense, or it probably isn't even coherent, this idea of there being an objective answer. And so that put me in a kind of funny situation where I really wanted to know what I should do with my life or what I should strive for or what's good. But I didn't believe anymore that there was an objective answer to that. And that's kind of an uncomfortable place to be. And as I reflected on this more and more, I started developing a new life philosophy that I ended up naming Valueism, which is kind of my attempt to say, well, what should you do? Should in quotes, even if you don't believe that there's some objective answer to what you should do. Valueism is very, very simple, but it has some pretty serious and surprising consequences. And so the very simple idea of it is to try to figure out what you intrinsically value. That is, what are the things that you fundamentally value for their own sake? The things that you don't value merely as a means to an end. And then once you figure it out, these things that you intrinsically value, try to take effective action to increase the things you value. So it's very, very simple. There's two parts. Figure out your intrinsic values, then try to take effective action to increase them in the world. And what is nice about that is it's based on what you fundamentally care about. And it gives you a kind of precise set of instructions, which is to look into yourself, to try to understand yourself deeply so you understand what you fundamentally care about. And then use that as your guide for what to do. So it removes the objectiveness from the universe to yourself. So yeah, I think there's a lot of nice features of this philosophy, and I found it really helpful for myself.
Yeah, I think For me, because as a millennial and someone who's lived through the so-called era of the last ban, I also have been very rudderless for a long time, and I found it pretty difficult without any sort of social scaffolding to hone in on these values. Because if you give me a list of potential values, I could say, I have more or less of an allegiance with all of them, especially, if they're like virtues and things that are, important. And it does seem to be pretty hard to assign kind of a cardinal order to them. And there's kind of shifting values as well, like depending on the stage of life, things kind of shift around as well. I've tried to do this exercise many times in my life to, okay, what are your values? Even I did CBT at one point because I was feeling stressed at work, and one of the first exercises they give you, it's like, okay, make a list of your values. And I've always found it really really tough. And I think a lot of people kind of gravitate towards more traditional value systems because in a way it is pretty difficult to hone in on this. For some people it's easier than others, but I think in general for you know I wouldn't say like the average person, it's not a trivial exercise. I don't know how you found it.
Well, I agree with you. It's not trivial exercise. And that's why we actually did a whole bunch of research on intrinsic values. And we actually created an assessment you can take, and it's totally free. It's called the Intrinsic Values Test. You can take it on our website, clearthinking.org. And it walks you through to help make sure you really understand what an intrinsic value is. And then it asks you a whole bunch of questions and it analyzes your intrinsic values for you. And so now, many, many thousands of people have taken this. And so we try to make it as easy as possible to figure out your intrinsic values.
Okay, well that's really useful, and I will do the test because it's
Great.
sounds
Love to
like
see what you
great
find.
tool. Perfect. Yeah, and I mean, what do you make of this kind of trend that I've seen a lot? And maybe this is also kind of an online thing, but it does tend to show little signs in my real life as well that people they kind of were divorced from religion, from more traditional kind of forms of worship, and now a lot of them, or maybe a significant portion of people, are getting curious again about the traditional religions. Do you think this is a what how do we assess this? Is this a good sign, a worrying sign? Would you then do rather than do something else?
Well, I think the power of religion for many people has faded over the decades, where there are many more non-religious people than there used to be. And, the thing about that is that religions solve certain problems pretty well. Like they help create an in-baked community. If you're struggling with something, your church might be able to help you. You can meet people at your church. They give you kind of a set of values and principles for living your life. They give you time to reflect on that. They give you, in some cases, daily behaviors that might be healthy in certain ways. And indeed, we see correlational evidence, at least, that religious people tend to be a bit happier. It's hard to say exactly why that is, but it could be because it gives them more sense of ease about the future, or because of more ease about death, or because of better communities. It's hard to say why, but it does seem to be the case. Okay, so people becoming less religious, religion seemed to provide things of value to people. So what happens now? Well, some people have tried to rebuild some of these benefits of religion in a non-religious way, building things like, community centers and so on. And it seems like they unfortunately haven't been adequate. It seems like they don't do as good a job at fulfilling some of those roles as religions did. Now, I'm not saying that religions are all good. There's also really bad problems with religion. For example, if you take a bird's eye perspective, imagine you're an alien, you landed on Earth, and you're looking at the religions of the world. It's just incredibly obvious that the religions of the world are incompatible with each other. One of them says you need to do X, Y, Z to not go to hell. Another one says there is no hell. A third one says you get reincarnated over and over again, and so on. Like there's no way on their fundamental tenets they could possibly be true at the same time. And what that means is that at most one of the world's major religions is true, which means almost every religious person is very likely believing in a false religion, right? It doesn't mean that there isn't some religion that's true, but it means that most people who believe in religion are believing a false religion. That's problematic because it means you might spend your life focusing on something that is not true, or you might live your life to avoid some hell that doesn't exist, or et cetera, right? So that's a problem with religion. Even if there's a true one, there are many false ones, right? Another problem with religion is that people that don't fit that system are often really badly harmed. For example, if you're gay and you live in an area, in a culture where everyone's religious and the religion tells them that being gay is horrible, then you're often really, really screwed. You're gonna be treated badly if people find out. So often you're gonna keep it a secret. It's gonna cause often bad psychological damage as you try to suppress those feelings, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So religion is not, just stepping back again, it's not all a good thing. It's not all a bad thing. It's complicated. Fortunately, secular society hasn't done a great job of filling in the gaps.
Yeah, I do believe that a lot of this disenchantment that we've seen across the world is also just kind of a revealed preference because a lot of the function of technology, this like the function of a religion, a lot of the social technology that it embedded, is just not needed anymore. Like the really tight-knit communities that were based on religion and that fed back into religious communities, like all of the functions that these supported, because of affluence and mass affluence, people just don't want to live that way anymore. They don't want to live in, multifamily homes. They want to kind of individualism in this case is a choice, and individualism is a bit of a corrosive to any sort of religion like that. I mean, some people still go to church, but it's just not the same thing if you're not like in the community. You're not sharing, giving back. You're not plugged into something that is kind of stationary. And now so many people are mobile and they want to be. Like you could see this. People are voting with their feet constantly to not be part of these traditional communities anymore. And I think that's been really tough for these communities to just be able to to hang together.
Well, I think one challenge religions have had is that they're rooted in the past. And some of the beliefs of the past are difficult to reconcile with a modern way of looking at things. And so you get this tension as people become to believe in these modern ideas. You have religions kind of resisting those ideas. And I think, unless the religions adapt, it's sort of natural that they'll lose more and more young people.
Yeah, I think the problem with religions adapting is that, you can't adapt away the core tenets or you dilute what the religion actually means. And I know a lot of people who are, there's kind of this trend in people going back to Eastern Orthodoxy because it's kind of a more solid religion. They've kind of held on to their rituals and kind of to the old style of religion and the popularity of the Latin Mass. This is fringe stuff. This is not like a mass, the general trend is, like you said, people are starting to kind of divest from religion, but the things that are kind of picking back up are these more hardcore, more old right type things, because it seems to offer an undiluted version of religion because a lot of the criticism, especially for American evangelical religion, is that it's just happy clappy Christian rock. It's not really tied into actual serious biblical study. So I think this is a huge challenge. Is there a way of making religions compatible while keeping them religions, or will it have to be some sort of complete reinvention?
Well, it sort of depends on your viewpoint. If you think that a religion is true and the book that it's talking about is the literal word of God, then you're going to be pretty tied down to what it says. If you think that the religion is not true, it's just sort of a set of useful customs and you can kind of, be fuzzy in your interpretations of things and adapt your interpretations over time, obviously it can adapt a lot more to modern society.
Yeah, I think a lot, I mean, probably I would say 99.9% of modern believers, even if they say that they do believe in, the exact tenets of the Bible or the Quran, if you dig down deep, the idea that you need to be stoned to death for eating shellfish and things like that, obviously these go out the window. There's all sorts of, cherry picking already happening, even the more hardcore sections. So yeah, I think it's a tough. I mean, everything's already reformed. It's been reformed 10 times over at this point. I think people are just kind of trying to hold on to a more palatable version of their faith. Which I've just see it, and it feels really tough for the old religions nowadays.
Yeah, I think people have this view, a little bit like with political parties like we talked about, where they think because the political party had the same name and had the same beliefs. I think it's true with religion, but even more so. The reality of religion is that they constantly are splitting apart into different sects. And sometimes that new sect will keep the same name. And so it's not that obvious that it is a different thing. But I've tried to kind of map out a history of branching in the Abrahamic religions, and it's absolutely wild. It's really like a tree that's just constantly spawning new branches. And then what's happening is that most of those branches die off. And so what you see is just the ones that didn't die off, and you kind of see this continuity through it. But in reality, it's just constant splitting. Most of them die off. A few survive, and that's kind of the history of it. And then we kind of look back and we think, oh, this is the same thing throughout time. And it really hasn't. You could trace some of the modern beliefs to decisions that were made at specific points in time. You're like, oh yeah, in the year 1000, they decided this thing, and now we still believe that today. And then there'll be other ideas that 1,000 years ago, they'll be like, what the hell are you talking about? That's not how you interpret this. It's just things have just totally changed.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because this maps very well into what's kind of going on, has been going on for a while in the online right, probably any sort of online community. But the splitting. I think what's interesting now about online is that everything's happening faster, and you also have a paper trail. So you see, there's a schism every 2 months. There's many factions. They're always kind of warring against each other, influencer X against influencer Y, beefs and things like that. So there's this kind of schizophrenic paper trail that's left behind all of this. And it is confusing, but I think this is just kind of the dynamic of any sort of group, but it's just much more visible and much more accelerated when you're dealing with it in a medium like Twitter or wherever you are online. I really wonder how what level we'll reach in a few years, because things have changed so much and just in the last 2 years. And I think it is fascinating to watch, especially if you're in the comfortable place of being completely outside the snow globe. I think it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I just hope that people are able to find worldviews that are healthier for them, because one thing about I think almost every worldview has something to offer, as we talked about. But that being said, they're not all equally healthy for the people in them or and for society broadly. And I think there's some pretty bad ideas out there that get popularity. So that's definitely something that makes me concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are all sorts of kind of in-group dynamics, especially now, because not only do people trying to position themselves well, in the view of their in-group, but they also are trying harder and harder to position themselves against the out-group, and that kind of creates this dynamic where there's like holier than thou type purity spirals within groups. And then you have things like, for example, the abortion debate. People are very much incentivized within one in group to say, okay, abortion is always murder. They're kind of whipping themselves into a frenzy to be extremely rigid and stalwart about this particular issue for their in-group. And then on the other side, seeing this, this extremely rigid position on the other side, they're like, okay, abortion is never murder, late-term abortions, everything should be, free. You have this, arms race between groups. And on every issue that you have that more and more, because the visibility not only of what the members of your in-group believe, but also what the members of the out-group and the monstrosity of the out-group is visible every day. It really is accelerating these processes, and I think in a very unhealthy way.
Thankfully, a lot of people are actually just pretty reasonable. If you actually just poll Americans, their views on abortion are pretty, moderate. They basically say, look, yeah, you probably shouldn't be aborting a baby right before it's born, but also it seems pretty reasonable to get an abortion if you get pregnant and you didn't intend to, and you don't think you can support the child. Yeah, it's pretty reasonable to get an abortion. I mean, that's what a lot of people think, and you get these kind of radical views on both sides that I think don't do a very good job of representing what typical Americans believe, but they get so much airtime. And then the kind of extremist viewpoints, they benefit by saying things that are outrageous, that make the other side seem like absolutely insane, and the whole thing kind of just gets messier and messier and angrier, but doesn't really reflect most people.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that that's true, and I hope that it continues to be true. I was just, the the fact that people are much more absorbed into these spheres, by the passing year. Just, I don't know. It feels like a bit of a worrying trend. Who knows? Things do tend to change quite rapidly. Another subject that I wanted to cover with you is how we should think about kind of average group differences. There's a lot of chatter on Twitter about group differences, different groups, obviously. But yeah, you have a very interesting article on this about kind of the two poles of considering this problem. Okay, how should we think about average group difference?
Yeah, if you're interested in this topic, I have an essay called Oversimplifiers versus Difference Deniers. You can find it on my website, spencergreenberg.com. But I think it's a really interesting and important topic where sometimes groups will differ in some trait. And unfortunately, what tends to happen in those situations is that people will polarize into two incorrect views. One side, which I call oversimplifiers, will say, oh, A's are like this and B's are like that. And the other side, which I call difference deniers, will say, oh, no, there's no difference between the groups. And let me just use a concrete example, which is men more violent than women, right? And if you actually look at the data on this, you find that on average, men are a little bit more violent than women. There is a difference in averages between the groups. And so we think of it as a bell curve. The mean of the bell curve, the center of the bell curve are shifted a little bit, with men being a little more violent on average. An oversimplifier would say men are violent, women are not, right? And a difference denier would say that's bullshit. They're just measuring violence wrong. Men aren't any different than women, right? So in this case, both groups would be mistaken. And you can see this kind of mistaken dichotomization appear on so many different topics throughout society. And you can see why it occurs, because if you're someone who thinks that, well, men are bad, then you want to jump on the, oh, men are violent, women are not bandwagon, right? You want to emphasize that difference and make it seem bigger than it is. Also, people tend to engage in stereotyping. A lot of it's subconscious, but they're kind of tempted to engage in this kind of thinking, this kind of like, oh, well, if men are a bit more violent, then that turns into men are violent, right? On the other hand, there are people that ideologically or for other reasons don't want to believe in a difference or think it's like immoral to believe in a difference, and so they want to deny the difference, hence the difference deniers. So I think it's very, very common that we see this dynamic. We see it play out throughout society. And I think it leads to both misinformation and people actually coming to less helpful policies than they could if they were just to accept reality as it actually is.
If you enjoyed this conversation up to this point, you will also enjoy the extended version of the conversation, which is over on Substack. That's at alexkashuta.com or on patreon.com/aksubversive. Patreon has just a podcast, and Substack has a community, the back catalog of all my writing, a lot more archival things, a few more exclusive episodes. So it's slightly more of an enhanced version of the show. I really appreciate any sort of contribution that listeners can make. I don't have ads. I mean, except for if you're watching this on YouTube, you probably saw a few YouTube ads. I'm trying to, monetize a little bit on YouTube, but in general, I don't have ads. If you want to listen to podcasts, there are no ads on it. So essentially, subscriptions is the only thing that works, and I really, really do appreciate if you could make a contribution. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.